So let's look at the newest standards. So Niels presented the three older standards that the MWDR working group is maintaining, MWN, MWL, and LOD. And I'm going to talk now about the fourth standard that is maintained by the working group, which is BWARM. BWARM stands for Bulk Communication of Work and Recording Metadata. And in principle, BWARM is MWN's big brother. And why did we need this? Well, at some point, the Mechanical Licensing Collective established under the Music Modernization Act came up with the need to have a standard that deals with much more data than is normally conveyed in a direct MWN message. So we needed to have a standardized mechanism for communicating in bulk musical work and recording information. And that means that this new BWARM standard differs in two aspects from MWN. First, it's a broadcast, so it's not a message that is directed to a specific addressee, but it's a download, a dump of database data into files that can then be accessed by users who have the rights to access them. And the second major difference is that because it's dealing with a lot of data that is dumped from the database in most cases, it's not an XML standard, but it's a flat file standard. And that's basically the two main differences. If we look at the choreography that is derived from this different use with being a broadcast rather than a directed message, it means that on the one hand side, we have as a feed provider, and on the other hand, we have the data feed recipient. And the communication between these two parties is mainly that it starts with the feed provider wanting to make the data accessible. So the feed provider creates files and collecting the data from all entities, and these files are then uploaded to an SFTP server as agreed between the feed provider and the feed recipient. And once all the data is uploaded there, the feed provider also uploads a manifest file which indicates what data is there and that the data upload is complete. And the feed recipient can monitor this. And once the feed recipient sees that the manifest file is uploaded, the feed recipient can download and ingest the files that are of interest to them. So what the next things we should look at is at what data is defined in a BWARM data feed. We started drawing an entity relationship diagram, modeling the database that is generating this feed, or from which this feed is generated. And there are mainly 5 areas for which data is stored in such a database or in such a data feed. And that's first, of course, musical works. So we have 3 files dealing with musical works. 1 file is dealing with the core data of a musical work. So, for example, there's a title, and then there are 2 additional files in which additional data is stored about musical works. One is dealing with additional identifiers, proprietary identifiers assigned to musical works. That is stored in a separate file. And there's also a file dealing with alternative titles. So if a musical work has several titles, the main title is stored as part of the works file, and additional titles are stored in a separate table. There's a similar setup for sound recordings and for releases. So there are 3 tables for sound recordings, 1 table containing or 1 file containing the core data for a sound recording, and then 1 additional file for proprietary identifiers and 1 file for titles. And for releases, we have just 2 tables, 2 files for the data. 1 is the release file, and the other one is a file for proprietary identifiers. Many of these files are going to refer to parties. So there are parties related to works, there are parties related to sound recordings, and these parties are not stored, or data about these parties is not stored in the musical works file and in the sound recordings file. There you just have a pointer to a separate file which lists all the data for parties. So for example, all these are names and identifiers for the parties, and this is much more efficient than storing party data in the sound recording file or in the musical work file. And Niels already explained that ride shares play a big role in the musical work standards, and these ride shares are actually stored in 2 tables, or in 2 files in the BWARM standard. One is about ride shares that have been claimed, for which there is a rights claim, and there's a separate table which has the data for unclaimed ride shares. I don't want to go through the data elements for each of these tables, but I would like to illustrate briefly how the BWARM standard describes this data. So for example, if we look at the works file, this is defined in the standard as a clause in which there is a table which lists all the data elements that are relevant to describe musical works, with the definition for these data elements, and then there is a defined data type for each of the elements. There is a defined cardinality, and the table also gives an example to illustrate what the data would look like that is in the table. So the files that are then stored in the data feed are tab separated, is tab separated data. So you would, for each record in such a data file, you would have 1 line, and you would list one after the other the data for each of the cell names. So if such a works file has 12 data elements, you would have then 12 cells, one next to the other, and you would have this set up for each of the records, and that means that your BWARM data would look like the screenshot that is on top of this slide. So you would have an identifier, you would have a title there, and you would then have some flags being set, and that's quite difficult to read, but since it's a tab separated file, you can easily import it into a spreadsheet application, and that's what's illustrated in the second screenshot with a red background. There, the work data is uploaded into a spreadsheet, and row 1 then gives the titles of the cells. So there's the cell names, and that allows easily to spot that the first cell is the feed provider's work ID, and the second column would contain the ISWCs. There are no ISWCs given here, but there are work titles always, and then there is, for example, the first flag that's in column G is whether there are rights in dispute for this particular word.
Just so I understand, this might be getting too technical. Is it a true pub sub model? Is there messages that go when there's updates and all that? Or is it just everybody's querying the same SFTP server for updates on some kind of a scheduled basis?
Are you going to address that in your presentation, or?
Yes, I will address the MLC implementation in a second. What I would say is that the standard isn't prescriptive about that. I think it's implied in the standard that each snapshot of the data replaces the previous ones. There isn't differential data sets. Would be a requirement.
And one more. Is it restricted who can be a feed provider? Is that anyone on the ecosystem?
No. We started with the MLC as the key implementer, and so the MLC, of course, made a lot of specifications depending on their requirements, and the standard is adapted to these requirements. But we are currently revising the standard, and we're about to publish a new version, which is probably going to be published early next year, in which we are also extending the standard to deal with not only with sound recordings, for example, but also with musical works, so with things that the MLC doesn't immediately need. And so we're making the standard already more general, so that anybody can come who wants to communicate musical work data in a similar way can come up and use the standard.
There's a question on our line asking whether this message is only used in respect of mechanical rights.
No, so in one of the, I think it's the right shares file, there is a field where you can express the right type, I believe.
Yes.
Which could be any of the DDEX allowed value sets. Obviously, the MLC's primary use case is mechanical right types in the US, but you could imagine that any other CMOs, PROs could use the standard and make it specific to their mandate.
Who maintains the hub? Like the central, or maybe I'm misunderstanding and this is still bidirectional between parties.
It's not. I mean, it's not in a hub in the sense that Niels described the hub for messaging, where you have a message sender routing a message to a message receiver via a hub, where the hub is doing some kind of maybe merging of messages or splitting up messages and rerouting. In this case, the hub as a database dump, as a file server, is maintained by the data feed provider. So the data feed provider sets up an SFTP server where all the data is stored and maintained, and it's up to the provider to decide how often the data is refreshed and so on. So the standard only describes the format in which this has to happen and the way the communication is done in terms of protocols.
No, it's not. It's not a universal hub was the question. I would say the standard, again, is not prescriptive on how you deploy your files. If you use the SFTP protocol, it could be that the recipient set up an SFTP server and it's up to the provider to post those files to those SFTP server. It feels a bit silly for a broadcast message, and it makes sense for a feed provider to maintain an SFTP server, but who knows?
Could be a third-party provider that that just does that. I think that's an important distinction that we need to take, actually, with respect to all of the four standards that we've talked about. DDEX defines the format and the mechanics, how they can be exchanged. DDEX does not do any or describe or define who does what role. So looking at BWARM, yes, the standard has been designed with the MLC in the background, but we have been very clear from the start and have included, for example, a territory code into the table so that the licenses can be made territory specific. Now, the MLC, they will always write US in there because that's their mandate. They will only do mechanical right. That's their mandate. But if somebody else wants to make a dump of their rights shared tables or their rights holdings or whatever, and include sync right in Cuba, go for it. That's what the standard is made for. And how they then disseminate that, whether they actually use FTP, which the standard says is the preferred. But if they want to use email, well, use email for it. So that we are quite permissive. DDEX is a permissive society. How you want to do that is completely up to you.
Hi, you may have addressed this already. How old is this standard? The BWARM standard, how long has it been in place?
Well, the Music Modernization Act was 2017 or whatever, and this came out more or less. So when the MMA had the end of their implementation period or whatever, the MLC had to be ready for doing it, and we were about a month earlier than that. So it's 19.
I do actually. It's in my slides.
No, that's okay. Stop me from embarrassing myself.
I think it's a slide I removed this morning. So the work started so the MMA was signed into an act of law in 2018. The work starting on BWARM in early 2019. And like Niels just said, it completed in late 2020 to go live on the 1st of January 2021. Because that place across the river making decisions a bit late. But yeah, so we've been producing snapshots since mid-January 2021. I don't think I've got the stat, but I think we produced something like 187 snapshots.
And as Stefan has said, it was a little bit of a rushed development, that standard, it has to be said, because of political pressure, because the decisions made what needs to be part of the feed was coming rather late at times, which means that there are things that we can do better about that standard, which is precisely why we are in the process of updating it. That update will not be a massive update. So your existing implementations needs to be tweaked, not ripped to shreds if you're having